The guard's laughter was the first thing that made my heart stop. I had walked into my husband's office building carrying a small birthday cake, wearing the blue dress he once told me made me look beautiful, expecting to surprise him before his evening meeting. Instead, the security guard looked at me with genuine confusion, then laughed softly as though I had made an innocent mistake. He glanced toward the elevators and said that he saw my husband's wife almost every day. I smiled nervously and told him that was impossible because I was his wife. The smile disappeared from his face. What happened next turned the happiest surprise I had planned into the most painful day of my life. Before we continue, if you believe that kindness, second chances, and the truth can change a person's life, please take a moment to like this story, share it with someone who needs to hear it, leave a comment, and subscribe to Kindness Speaks. Your support helps us bring more emotional stories of love, heartbreak, courage, and second chances. My name is Claire, and for almost 11 years, I believed I knew my husband better than anyone in the world. We had not started with money or luxury. When we married, we lived in a tiny apartment above a grocery store where the pipes rattled at night and the kitchen window refused to close during winter. My husband, Daniel, was ambitious even then. He worked long hours, studied late into the night, and dreamed of someday becoming the kind of businessman who could build something of his own. I believed in him when almost nobody else did. When he failed his first business venture, I sold the gold bracelet my mother had given me so he could pay his employees. When he finally succeeded, he promised that he would never forget the years when we had nothing but each other. Those early years were not glamorous, but they were full of warmth. We celebrated small victories with cheap takeout. We laughed when the electricity went out. We planned imaginary vacations while sitting on our old sofa. Daniel used to come home exhausted, place his head in my lap, and tell me that one day he would give me everything I deserved. I never cared much about everything. I wanted him to come home. I wanted his hand reaching for mine across the bed. I wanted the quiet certainty that whatever happened outside our front door, inside our home we belonged to each other. Eventually, Daniel's company grew. The little office became a larger office, and the larger office became a glass building downtown with his name displayed in polished metal near the entrance. His clothes became expensive. His meetings moved from small restaurants to private rooms. His phone began ringing constantly. At first, I was proud. I told everyone that my husband had worked for everything he had. I kept photographs from the early days in a box, smiling whenever I looked at them because I remembered the man underneath the expensive suit. But success changed the rhythm of our marriage. Daniel started coming home later. Then he began traveling more. He stopped telling me about his day unless I specifically asked. Sometimes he would sit at the dining table with his phone in his hand, barely noticing the meal I had prepared. I tried not to complain because I remembered how hard he had worked to reach that position. Whenever I felt lonely, I reminded myself that this was temporary. He was busy because he was building our future. Then there were the small things. He began locking his phone. He changed the password on his laptop. He started taking calls outside the bedroom. He bought a new cologne that I had never smelled before. When I asked about it, he casually said it was a gift from a client. I wanted to believe him. Love has a strange way of protecting the person who may be hurting you. It convinces you to ignore evidence because accepting the truth feels more frightening than living inside a lie. There were nights when I lay awake listening to the sound of his car arriving in the driveway. I would hear the front door open, his shoes crossing the hallway, and then the bedroom door would slowly move. Sometimes he would kiss my forehead and think I was asleep. I would keep my eyes closed because I was afraid that if I looked at him, I might see something I wasn't ready to understand. Still, I never imagined another woman. Not seriously. I had too much history with him to believe that everything could disappear so easily. Then came his birthday. Daniel had never been a man who cared much about birthdays, but that year I decided to surprise him anyway. We had been distant for months, and I desperately wanted to bring back the feeling we had once shared. I remembered how he used to love the chocolate cake from a little bakery near our first apartment, so I ordered one with the same flavor. I even found a simple blue dress similar to the one I wore on our 5th anniversary. That morning, I packed the cake carefully and placed a handwritten note beneath the box. I wrote that no matter how much life had changed, I still remembered the boy who once promised me forever in a tiny apartment with broken windows. I didn't tell him I was coming. I imagined walking into his office, seeing his surprised expression, and maybe watching him smile the way he used to. I imagined him putting aside his phone and wrapping his arms around me. Perhaps this silly little surprise would remind us both that we were still the same people beneath everything that had changed. I drove downtown with a strange mixture of nervousness and excitement. The building was enormous. Glass walls reflected the gray afternoon sky, and people in expensive suits moved through the lobby with hurried expressions. I had been there only a few times, usually for company dinners or formal events. Daniel's employees knew me, but I preferred staying away from his workplace because I never wanted to interfere. That afternoon, I walked toward the security desk carrying the cake. The guard looked up. He was an older man with silver hair, a neatly trimmed mustache, and a kind face. He smiled politely and asked whom I was visiting. I gave him Daniel's name. He looked at me for a moment. Then he laughed. It wasn't a cruel laugh. That somehow made it worse. He shook his head and said he saw Daniel's wife every day. I thought he was joking. I smiled and explained that I was Daniel's wife. His expression changed instantly. He stared at me. Then he glanced toward the elevators. He asked whether I was sure. I remember feeling embarrassed before I felt afraid. I thought maybe there was some mistake. Perhaps Daniel had told his employees someone else was coming. Perhaps the guard had confused me with another person. But then the guard quietly described her. A woman who came into the building several mornings each week. A woman who walked directly past the security desk. A woman who Daniel's employees greeted with familiarity. A woman who sometimes went upstairs carrying coffee. And according to the guard, Daniel had introduced her as his wife. The cake suddenly felt impossibly heavy in my hands. I couldn't hear the lobby anymore. People were walking around me, phones were ringing, elevators were opening and closing, but everything sounded distant, as if I were underwater. I asked the guard when he had last seen her. He hesitated. Then he told me she had been there that very morning. I thanked him. I don't remember walking toward the elevator. I don't remember pressing the button. I only remember staring at my reflection in the metal doors. There I was, wearing the blue dress I had chosen for my husband, holding his birthday cake, looking like a woman who had walked into the wrong life. When the elevator doors opened, I stepped inside. Daniel's executive floor was quiet. The receptionist recognized me immediately, and stood up so quickly that her chair rolled backward. Her face told me everything before she said a word. She had seen me before. But her eyes were filled with something I had never seen there before. Pity. I asked if Daniel was in his office. She said he was. I asked if he was alone. She didn't answer. I walked toward his office. The door was partially open. I could hear laughter. A woman's laughter. Then I heard Daniel's voice. The voice he hadn't used with me in years. Warm. Relaxed. Happy. I stopped outside the door. For several seconds I couldn't move. The cake box slipped slightly in my hands. Then I heard the woman say something about dinner. Daniel answered that he would make sure they had enough time together that evening. My fingers went cold. I pushed the door open. Daniel looked up. The woman beside him turned. For one long second, nobody spoke. She was beautiful, but that wasn't what destroyed me. It was the familiarity between them. The way she was sitting comfortably in his private office. The way her hand rested near his. The way Daniel's face changed when he saw me. He didn't look guilty at first. He looked terrified. And somehow that was worse. I placed the cake on the nearest table. My hands were shaking so badly that I could barely steady the box. I didn't scream. I didn't slap him. I didn't ask who she was. I simply looked at the man I had loved for 11 years and realized that I no longer recognized him. The woman stood up. She tried to explain something, but I raised my hand. I wasn't ready to hear another word. Daniel came toward me, but I stepped backward. He said my name. I asked him one question. I asked whether he had ever introduced that woman as his wife. His silence answered me. There are moments when a person's entire life can change without a single loud sound. That was mine. I walked out. I didn't know where I was going. I drove for almost an hour without realizing where the road was taking me. Eventually I pulled into the parking lot of a small public park where Daniel and I had once celebrated our first anniversary. I sat inside the car and stared at the cake in the passenger seat. The icing had begun to collapse from the heat. The little message I had written on top had smeared. I started crying. Not because he had another woman. Not even because he had lied. I cried because I suddenly understood how many moments of my life had been built around something that wasn't real. Every anniversary. Every photograph. Every promise. Every night I had waited for him. Every time I had defended him. Every time I told someone that Daniel was simply busy. I had been protecting a marriage he had already abandoned. That night, Daniel came home. I was sitting at the kitchen table. The house was silent. He tried to explain. He told me things had become complicated. He said he had made mistakes. He said he never intended to hurt me. But none of those words could change what had happened. I asked him how long. He couldn't answer immediately. Finally, he admitted it had been almost 2 years. 2 years. I thought about all the birthdays, holidays, family dinners, and ordinary mornings during those 2 years. He had looked at me across the breakfast table, while carrying a secret that could have destroyed me. I asked him why he did it. He said he didn't know. But I knew. Sometimes people don't betray you because you weren't enough. They betray you because they are willing to sacrifice something precious for something temporary. That distinction took me months to understand. The following weeks were brutal. I moved into the guest room. Then I left the house altogether. I rented a small apartment across town with a balcony barely large enough for 2 chairs. I brought only what I needed. Clothes. Books. Photographs. A few kitchen items. The box containing our old memories. At first, I couldn't sleep. I would wake up expecting to hear Daniel's breathing beside me. Then I would remember. My appetite disappeared. Friends tried to help. Some told me to leave him immediately. Others told me that successful marriages survived difficult periods. One person even suggested I forgive him because he had money and because starting over would be difficult. But I learned something important. Forgiveness and reconciliation are not the same thing. Forgiving someone doesn't mean giving them permission to hurt you again. Sometimes forgiveness simply means deciding that their choices will no longer control the rest of your life. Daniel eventually began asking to see me. He sent flowers, letters, long messages. He promised he would change. I didn't respond. Not because I wanted revenge. Because I needed silence. I needed to hear my own thoughts without his voice filling them. Then, one rainy afternoon, the old security guard from Daniel's building appeared outside my apartment. I recognized him immediately. He looked uncomfortable. He said he had something he needed to tell me. He explained that after I left that day, he had asked around. He had learned that the woman Daniel had introduced as his wife wasn't simply a secret girlfriend. She had been involved with the company. And there was something else. The guard had seen her arriving with Daniel repeatedly, but he had also noticed something that bothered him. She had been using Daniel's name to gain access to restricted areas and meeting executives privately. The guard had become suspicious. He had quietly reported what he saw to someone on the company's board. An investigation had begun. The woman wasn't who Daniel believed she was. She had been manipulating him. She had convinced him to give her access to financial information and internal accounts. The betrayal wasn't only personal. It was becoming a business disaster. The guard didn't come to tell me this because he wanted me to take Daniel back. He came because he felt guilty. He said that when he laughed at me that day, he had no idea what was happening. He apologized. I told him he had nothing to apologize for. He had unknowingly opened my eyes. Sometimes the person who breaks your heart is not the person who saves you. Sometimes the person who saves you is simply the one who tells you the truth when everyone else is afraid to. Over the next several months, Daniel's company went through an internal investigation. The woman disappeared from the company. Financial irregularities were discovered. Daniel lost several major clients. His reputation suffered. And for the first time, he experienced something I had known for months. What it felt like to lose control. One evening, he came to my apartment without warning. He looked completely different. Not because he had become poor. Because the confidence was gone. He stood outside my door and admitted that he had finally understood what he had done. He said that while chasing success, he had treated the person who loved him most as though she would always be waiting. He said he had confused having someone with deserving someone. I listened. But I didn't rush into his arms. I didn't tell him everything was okay. Because it wasn't. I told him that regret was not the same as change. He needed to become a better man whether I returned to him or not. That was the first time he didn't argue. He simply nodded. Months passed. I began rebuilding my life. I took a job at a small community organization that helped families struggling financially. I had never imagined myself doing that kind of work, but something about helping people rebuild gave me peace. I met women who had lost homes, men who had lost jobs, families who had experienced tragedies far greater than mine. Their stories taught me that pain does not disappear because someone tells you to be strong. Pain changes when you give it somewhere to go. Mine went into helping others. One afternoon, a woman came into the organization carrying a small child. She needed help finding temporary housing. As I listened to her story, I realized that I wasn't thinking about Daniel anymore. I was thinking about her. And that was when I knew I was healing. Not because I had forgotten. Because I had stopped making my wound the center of my world. Almost a year after the day at the office, I received a letter from Daniel. It was short. There were no promises. No requests. He simply said that he understood if I never wanted to see him again. He said he had started therapy, stepped away from certain business responsibilities, and spent time repairing relationships with people he had neglected. At the end, he wrote that he finally understood something I had tried to teach him years earlier. Love was not proven by what a person gave you when everything was easy. Love was proven by what they protected when they had the power to destroy it. I didn't answer the letter immediately. 3 weeks later, I agreed to meet him at a quiet cafe. He arrived early. He looked nervous. We talked for 2 hours. Not about getting back together. Not about the other woman. We talked about who he had become. I told him that I still loved the man he had once been. He said he was trying to become worthy of being that man again. I told him that I couldn't promise him another chance. He said he wasn't asking for one. That answer surprised me. For the first time, he understood that love wasn't something he could demand. It was something he had to earn. Over the next year, we slowly became friends. There were no dramatic reunions. No instant forgiveness. Just small acts. He checked on my mother. He returned old photographs. He helped the community organization anonymously. He never told anyone about it. When I discovered it, I asked why. He said because helping people wasn't supposed to be a performance. That sentence stayed with me. Eventually, I realized that Daniel had genuinely changed. But I had changed too. I was no longer the woman who believed loving someone meant enduring everything they did. I had learned boundaries. I had learned self-respect. I had learned that being alone could be painful, but being with the wrong person could be far lonelier. 2 years after the day at the office, I returned to that building. Not as Daniel's wife. Not as the woman carrying a birthday cake. I was there to attend a charity meeting organized by the company. As I entered the lobby, I saw the same security guard sitting behind the desk. He looked up. For a moment neither of us spoke. Then he smiled. I smiled back. He told me that he had remembered me all those years. I told him that I remembered him too. He joked that he would never laugh at another woman carrying a cake again. We both laughed. This time, the laughter didn't hurt. Daniel was waiting upstairs. We talked briefly after the meeting. Then he asked whether I would have dinner with him. I looked at him for a long moment. The old version of me would have said yes immediately. The woman I had become took a breath. Then I agreed. Not because the past had disappeared, but because sometimes two people can meet again after becoming better versions of themselves. Our relationship did not return to what it had been. It became something different. Slower. More honest. More deliberate. There were difficult conversations. There were moments when old memories returned. There were days when I questioned everything. But Daniel never demanded that I forget. He understood that trust had to be rebuilt one brick at a time. And perhaps the most beautiful thing was that I didn't need him to save me anymore. I had already saved myself. Years later, when people asked me how our marriage survived such betrayal, I never gave them a simple answer. Because the truth was that our old marriage didn't survive. It ended that afternoon in the office. The marriage that came afterward was something new. It was built from honesty instead of assumptions. From boundaries instead of fear. From actions instead of promises. And from two people who finally understood that love isn't about never making mistakes. It's about what you do after you realize you've broken something precious. Daniel once told me that the day I walked into his office,